Welcome everyone to a quick discussion about Linux firmware. Just because I found this here like basically yesterday, building our Linux distribution. T2 just roll Linux cross-compiled and stuff, and the ISO became even larger, and of course we now build GCC with Ada because of course not only Ada, also Objective-C and Fortran. Maybe Argo, but also GCC only 100 megabyte here, right? And the crazy thing is that stands out here is Linux firmware, 223 megabyte, and that's then not compressed. If we du that here, that are 866 freaking megabyte. Actually, a few base 8. Anyway, in pure bytes, that is 866, and that is super crazy large, right? I never even thought that much about. So what is this Linux firmware, right? The name is a little bit misnamed, similar to the Linux subsystem for Windows. That is basically not Linux-based firmware. That is firmware from vendors. That is not open source. It's not really part of the Linux kernel. Well, it's now living outside anyway. So this is a vendor closed binary proprietary firmware to make graphic cards work, right? Or GPUs, basically everything. And this is crazy that also, licenses, right? Freaking crazy licenses. And this is everything from SCSI controllers from decades ago, or not this, some other AIC, whatever. This is wireless and even Ethernet. And I wonder if that scales, even DSP's 56K freaking firmware of all crazy stuff. And I wonder slightly if this scales, right? For one thing, it is amazing that we have one central place to curate and have a license that allows us to distribute it, because previously, even small little companies like Matrox or others, or larger companies like Broadcom, at times did not even allow firmware distribution, right? Redistribution. You download the firmware, and then you're not allowed to share it on a pre-pressed CD or nowadays over the freaking internet. And so on one thing, of course, there are really many benefits of one central firmware catalog of all. It's not really all known. There's only all relevant to the Linux kernel for the drivers as used there. And it's not all. There of course is double, triple, or even more amount of firmware that is either doesn't allow redistribution. You have still this issue with Broadcom, for example. So certainly, even for my Retina MacBook Pro, some decade-old Broadcom doesn't have redistributable firmware. And then there are, of course, all those crazy devices, 3D Labs, Power VR, and many other. Even Apple, Asahi, Linux project. Even they, I wonder. With wireless, I think their strategy is to extract the firmware similar to NVIDIA, right, where we updated the other day, from macOS, for example, is it Broadcom Wi-Fi? And so thankfully on ARM, Apple Silicon, they load firmware for the GPU within the early firmware, so we don't need microcode there. But I think they have stuff like, not only there's one USB controller that Mark Hahn reversed some month ago. It's like, 2022, some freaking USB 3 controller doesn't just work because it doesn't bundle with firmware. But also the wireless stuff as per usual. And so another way, I should say this is the cheap version, right? So why do companies do that? Previously, they often included some ROM, decades ago, mask ROM, nowadays, of course, since decades, flash ROMs. And this costs money, right? They could for each, and also space, although space usually is not that limited unless very mobile devices, but it's cost, right? And the crazy stuff is they only save some cents in buying this in quantities of tens or hundreds thousands, if not millions for some devices. This is, of course, sure, it adds up, right? If you pay some cents for freaking I2C or so serial ROM, it costs you a tiny little bit, multiply this with 100,000, then you have some real savings. And I would say for the most part it is savings. We had that in network cards in the 80s, 90s, that you had an optional option ROM for network booting. And some people argue there is also this big discussion between GNU, Free Software Foundation, and even people like Asahi Linux. I saw this on Twitter the other month, that the Asahi Linux people actually argued, we don't even care. It is amazing, like, that some firmware isn't burnt in there, that is like more freedom because you can load it unless it's digitally signed and stuff. Although, to be fair, I think the truth is somewhere in the middle, but leave me in the comments below, because as far as I remember, some like Free Software Foundation argue for the freedom, have the firmware on the device. However, Mark Hahn said something I not directly quote, but paraphrase of, yeah, but for the freedom, if it's on the hardware, you can't change it anyway. And so like it's not like more freedom to have it burned into the hardware. Although I would argue in their Wi-Fi thing, it is a little bit annoying that on the installer for Asahi Linux you need to extract the Wi-Fi firmware, but yeah. Long story short, for me, I mean, basically it doesn't matter the most, unless you have situations where for Broadcom or other stuff you can't redistribute the firmware. But for me, the thing is also, it makes the ISO freaking large, right? And this is mostly why I talked about this today. For me, it's a little bit, this is super crazy, right? In 866 megabytes, this is so much freaking firmware. Previously, you would have had a whole Linux distribution in there. Nowadays, it is not, oh wait a second, this was packages there. It's not, how many, but it's actually more than 10%. This is like honestly, this is like 20% of the ISO, and this is crazy, right? All the Xorg server that nobody wants to use anymore, Wayland, the Linux kernel, all the, I mean, even the crazy thing is the driver part of the Linux kernel is less, well, compressed anyway, so all the drivers we compile, less code, 80 megabyte, I think, and the firmware is nearly 4 times as much, right? And this is super crazy. For me, this is mostly, sure, I could YOLO, whatever, we have a lot of bandwidth and stuff, but maybe I optimized it a little bit of stripping out the firmware that is not needed on this platform, because right now we would have there all the firmware for other exotic stuff in there. So maybe I spent some extra hour of iterating over all the firmware files and matching them, whether they are actually built as modular into the kernel, because otherwise it doesn't make much sense to distribute stuff. For example, for RISC-V, where some AMD GPU doesn't really work unless you use my patches, or Sun, Spark, PowerPC. And just to get the ISO size also down. The crazy stuff is, so this is also not CD, well, not that you would often burn this stuff on CD unless you install it on a PowerPC probably. But every month, the crazy thing is, every month I now increase the ISO size from 800 to 900 to 1000. Now I increase the default ISO size to 1.5 gigabyte. And as you see, it's not even like Rust, LVM, Linux and GCC. It's a freaking Linux firmware, and that is a big part. Another scary thing is, of course, that so much software has, of course, bugs. And of course, you see this, right? They update this here, and this is certainly the best thing. Do we have, yeah, this is yesterday what we updated. So of course there are bugs inside, and that is also the scary thing, right? Firmware larger than Linux kernel drivers, full of bugs, even AAA stuff like AMD GPU, like let's update this stuff because hangs, also MJPEG decodes, so whatever, also who knows, maybe other thing, and you can't debug this. This is a crazy thing with all the firmware. People sometimes ask me, but is it open? No, this is not open. 99% of the stuff, maybe for some stuff you find some sources somewhere leaked or intentionally. I think maybe some adaptive early SCSI firmware might have been open and even assembled in the Linux kernel, as far as I remember anyway. Correct me if I'm wrong. But you can't fix anything in there, right? So if you write an open source driver and your AMD GPU stuff crashes, then it's like, yeah, good luck, you can't change it, right? As someone asked just today, is there a reason some people say no? I understand that the companies don't want to disclose even more of their stuff. AMD is, of course, one of the better companies producing documents, sharing documents. And I can understand that the companies don't want to share more of the inner workings of all their secret sauce. However, the other thing is that if the companies stops updating the firmware, although you would hope until then it's mostly bug-free, but then in some years we need to work around this, right? Or we need to reverse engineer this, which is certainly rather difficult for GPU firmware as complex as this. But then at that point you also need to start what you anyway would need to do. If you reverse engineer and work with Windows extracted firmware, you anyway need to work around in potential open drivers with firmware bugs, stuff that Windows did differently, API call sequences and other such stuff, or simply features and values not used by the Windows driver that may or may not work, may have been tested or may not have been tested. So yeah, closed firmware, whether extracted from Windows, shipped by the vendor, you can't change it. You often find bugs even with my work, I often find bugs and you can't change it. That is certainly, yeah, a rather annoying thing, but certainly something that people are used to working with hardware and software. Anyway, leave in the comments below what you think of this situation, and it's of course only growing, right? For every year we get new AMD, potentially, eventually, previous video, Novo, Nvidia, Intel GPUs, Wi-Fi nowadays, of course, most of the firmware. Another thing we could actually do, we could split this at T2. Here, also too many tabs. Another solution would be to split the package and ship Linux firmware net and Linux firmware SCSI and stuff, so that we wouldn't necessarily need to ship all of them. Maybe for today or this week I try to see how complex it is to ship only the firmware needed. One thing I wonder, we built a mostly modular kernel. I only wonder how to detect firmware that is built in the Linux kernel. Maybe that is a thing. Yeah, there it starts, right? You have some idea, does it work, reliable? And then the issue is, of course, you rebuild a kernel and then you might need other firmware that you T2 didn't install. But the sheer amount that triggered me a little bit and I wanted to share that. So I hope you learned something with all the firmware, serial mask, flash ROMs are also, maybe I should actually say last but not least, why is this firmware needed? Actually, in the 80s, 90s, and even in the 2000s, a lot of hardware did not require firmware. Early Ethernet, even early CPUs didn't have loadable microcode. Early x86 CPUs had microcode, but it was mask ROM, basically manufactured, masked, read-only memory inside the CPU. That this became updatable was a later thing, some Pentium Pro 2, something in that area. And even network cards didn't require firmware a long time ago. This was, now that stuff became more complex, mostly with Wi-Fi, but eventually also Ethernet now, gigabit Ethernet at times also has firmware. Also because more and more stuff, gigabit network interface cards, storage stuff, NVMe or other storage, so complex that it also has microprocessors and, as I said earlier, saving costs, cutting corner. And of course, another thing, it's not only saving costs, but also, for example, NVMe stuff needs to have the firmware, right? Because otherwise it doesn't boot. So some hardware still needs to ship with firmware in such a way that you can boot, and NVMe stuff usually is not software microcode updated, but other stuff, for example, SCSI. I've also wondered that some stuff in Linux, I wonder how that was created, because actually, for example, SCSI stuff 20 years ago also came with bootable ROM. I'm not really sure why the Linux kernel had the habit of always updating the firmware. Maybe with the SCSI stuff, maybe it at times could be that it is like basic boot ROM, and then the Linux kernel loaded more advanced firmware, or it was often outdated and broken in the Linux kernel than, for example, Adaptic AIC7XXX or something, to have high performance and more features and stuff, potentially such stuff. But even with NVIDIA GPUs, right, of course they can post and boot, and obviously not reclock and running at boost frequency. I slightly wonder why Novo necessarily need to load firmware, although maybe the graphic card, maybe I should actually analyze that. Share, like, subscribe, Patreon and membership and stuff. That certainly would be interesting to know, but this is stuff that even I don't know and would need to research for some hours. If the NVIDIA option ROM, so to say, EFI ROM, only includes like basic enablement and, for example, not 3D stuff, so that like only basic frame buffer scan out and very basic stuff works. And sure, the Windows driver also loads firmware, maybe the latest. I slightly wonder if NVIDIA cards would at least work basically without this signed blessed firmware from NVIDIA additionally by the operating system. Anyway, leave in the comments below what you think. Is this stuff too large? Should it be more optional? Of course, in a microkernel, another way would be to ship drivers with the firmware bundled and not have this monolithic repositories. In a way, it's ironic that it is exactly the other way of X3, right? From X3, they transition from this monolithic repository with all drivers to modular drivers, and now it's mostly obsolete because Wayland, X Wayland, right? But on the Linux kernel, they still stick to everything in one repository, which sure has benefits. You have all the drivers to mass substitute APIs for cleanups and innovation in one tree, but on the other hand, you end up with 80 megabyte compressed packages and this firmware. So with stable driver APIs, you could theoretically have driver packages installed with the firmware bundle. That would be, of course, a Windows thing. In Windows or Mac OS, you would have the firmware bundled with the driver so that you have your operating system kernel extension and the firmware next to it, for example, like on Mac OS or Linux. But yeah, Linux stuff a little bit different, not necessarily better, but at least one pro thing that I can appreciate is having this archived catalog here, just that it's, I wonder how much this scales in the future. And of course, I wonder if eventually they start deleting stuff. Wouldn't surprise me. It's like, yeah, too big, like I say today, and eventually they delete vintage and retro stuff. But anyway, that's it for today. I hope you learned something. As usual, leave me your thoughts and questions down below, and I hope to see you soon for more.